I've done with my announcements. Please welcome Fred.
Good morning, scholars of HASP. I've been trying to pick, doing the first two sessions on McCarthyism was easy enough because McCarthy is such a lightning rod for all kind of commentary about what democracy shouldn't be like. But after you get through doing all that, what do you do about McCarthyism when it comes down to McCarthyism today, the third part? Well, I guess the best way to start talking about it was to consider what the way things were then. In 1954, when he decided to wage war on the US Army and pick a fight with the US Army, communism obviously was a major concern for the world. The Cold War was not some imaginary kind of activity. It really was the Russian bear, Soviet communism, Chinese communism. It appeared to be on the move. The Korean War had started and ended in a stalemate by the United States, which was a very unusual thing for American policymakers, for American military people. Just not the way we wanted to end conflicts, not after having ended the Civil War and the Spanish-American War and World Wars I and II with unconditional surrenders. So fighting a limited war with a ceasefire, what was for that generation, well, just unusual, particularly after having seen in their lifetimes the rise of totalitarian dictators in Italy, militarist Japan, and of course Nazi Germany, and also the Soviet Union, the rather tenuous partnership with the Russians during World War II. And now here they were again, facing another dictator. And what that generation had understood was that what they learned so clearly from Adolf Hitler's bloodless victories, that is when he reoccupied the Rhine, reoccupied the Saar, took over the Sudetenland, did Anschluss with Austria, that if you don't stand up to a dictator, sooner or later, you're going to have to fight him anyway. Or as Winston Churchill said, what is an appeaser but someone who feeds a crocodile hoping it will eat him last? So in 1954, that generation that lived through the Great Depression, World War I, then the Great Depression, then World War II, by the time you get to the 1950s, that generation essentially said, you know what, when it comes to dictators, totalitarian rule, anti-democratic movements, enough. So of course they were concerned about communism. Concerned just enough for an opportunistic lowlife to come along and take advantage of their fears.
In early 1954, with his power at its peak, Senator McCarthy takes a gamble. Armed with the flimsiest of evidence, he takes on a respected institution, the U.S. Army. He claims it is infiltrated by communists and that senior officers are turning a blind eye. The explosive charges trigger public hearings in the Senate. Live TV coverage provides millions of Americans with their first sustained look at the crusading senator and his bare-knuckle methods.
In this committee, activities may well determine whether this nation will live or die.
I want to make it clear that the United States Army does not coddle communists. This committee knows that. The American people know that.
For over a month, McCarthy and his team exchange fire with the Army's counsel. June 9th, 1954. A lawyer for the Army, Joseph Welch, demands that McCarthy's staff release its secret list of alleged Army subversives. McCarthy responds by dredging up a past link between a young lawyer in Welch's firm and the Communist Party.
I don't think you have any conception of the danger of the Communist Party.
After years of bullying his victims, McCarthy is smug and confident. But Welch counterattacks.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman. But your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me.
Mr. Chairman.
millions of Americans watch.
He was just bathing, he hasn't bathing.
Senator, may we not drop this? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
McCarthy's gamble, taking on the Army, backfires.
Mr. Welch here has been...
His charges don't stick. Many in his own party turn against him. 6 months later, the Senate officially censures him. His reign of terror is over, and his reputation in tatters. He falls into the grip of alcoholism, which in 1957 kills him at the age of 48. McCarthy, in many ways, was destroyed by the power of television, a power that in the 1950s will only continue to grow.
You know, the reactions to that kind of information is interesting to me. Now, when you all heard that he died at the age of 48, people went, oh, that's so young. Across the street, they go, ew, that's so old. But I have here, how was it possible for Joe McCarthy, first of all, to rise to prominence? And more than that, why did people let him? You understand that in a democracy, especially our democracy, these kind of things cannot happen unless we let them. Let Edmund Burke, or is attributed to Edmund Burke as far as I know, the only way bad men and women can triumph is if good men and women let them. So how was it that people allowed themselves to be cowed, terrorized, intimidated? And I get it. I get it. I don't want to make light or minimize the fact that to stand up to somebody powerful that has the power to ruin you personally, vocationally, economically is not a small thing. But on the other hand, that's how the needle of history moves when people do that. And Joseph Welch said, your cruelty and your recklessness. That's the other aspect. So today when I hear people saying things like, and I've been hearing people say this ever since 2016, can you believe what blah, blah, blah just said? My response is, yes, I can believe it. Why can't you? After everything else you see with your own eyes, why can you not believe this? Let me be straight up with you. Okay, because as a person of color, when I hear people saying things like that, I can't afford to just go like, well, that's just so-and-so being themselves. I know there are people out there that will believe so-and-so and take their words and put action behind them. So I can't exist in a world where things like that possibly can't happen. They've happened too often, and the historical record is replete with evidence that so-and-so's words are not confined just to so-and-so. I mentioned to you all the last time that my professor, Dr. Harold Schwartz, back at Kent State, Dr. Schwartz was, he and I spent long hours in his office talking about what had happened to Jews throughout history. And Dr. Schwartz said, Mr. Johnson, believe me when I tell you, there's no idea too stupid, too cruel, too unlikely for people that aren't follow it. So there's always somebody out there willing to do it. I didn't believe him then, but I believe him very much now. So how and why Joe McCarthy came to power, and then that's what it was then. And now, back then, 1954, it was the Army McCarthy hearings. Now we have, among other things, just one of many things, the big lie. How and why did we get to a situation, a moment in time where the Capitol, where insurrection was staged? How and why have we let people sit up and tell us these were just tourists? I grew up in the DC area. I've seen people people in front of the Capitol area lots of times down there. I've been a tourist myself more times than I can count. The Capitol these days, my Washington, DC that I grew up in, that I grew up near, is so different. It's really sad. If people have been to Washington before, especially before 9/11, they got the concrete barriers. You used to be able to walk to places. It was truly the people's monuments. We pay for our tax dollars. Now they have them channeled off, security everywhere. It's almost like an armed camp. And this one from the inside. Why are so many people willing to go along with this? How did we get to this point? We get Joe McCarthy. He had communism that he was using as a tool to expedite what he was talking about. So all these elements come together to make me ask this question. What were they thinking? Who's they? Well, they would be, what made the people that thought they were going to kidnap a sitting governor? What was it that made them, what I thought to myself, what's going on in their mind that tells them this would be a good idea? We'll get away with this. What made them think? You see, people, that's what I mean. People that have this kind of thought, it may seem crazy to me, but it seems crazy to me. It's not the point. It doesn't seem crazy to them to try it. That's the main point. Yes, it's crazy, I agree, but not crazy to them. Her life was in real danger. What made people think that they could storm the Capitol, threaten the vice president, and try to upend American democracy? What made them think this was a good idea? But that's not the point. They thought they could get away with it. What made them think that? That's the more operative question. What makes you think that an election that goes to more than 60 court challenges go to federal courts and are overturned again and again and again, and people still keep on peddling the same big lie? What made you think you could get away with that? Now that is deeply rooted in the currents of American history. So I decided to borrow a page from a presentation I did earlier this year, where starting with George Washington, who, as the first president of the United States, gave us a lot of stuff. I mean, he gave us a good template for what good leadership looks like, what integrity looks like, what an American president, under the best and worst of circumstances, ought to aspire to. I did a presentation for the Sons of the American Revolution about 2 weeks ago. I said to them, look, I have this ongoing admiration for George Washington. And some of my students, especially my students of color, sometimes have said, but Professor Johnson, he owned slaves. Like, yes, he did. And I really wish he hadn't. I really wish he hadn't. Out of my heart of hearts, he wish he hadn't. But then I said to them, we have to learn to have two thoughts in our mind at the same time. Can we do that? He was an imperfect human being that did a terrible thing on his slaves, but also left us a good blueprint and template for government. Can we at least balance those two things? So we can do that, then we can get past that other thing, not deny it, not overlook it, but pay attention to the part that pertains to governance. And what he left us in 1796 for a farewell. Because in George Washington's farewell, they left us in 1796 to 1996, 200 years go by and then some up to 2023. Over 200 years ago, this man who had dealt face to face with tyranny and absolute government, he knew what democracy didn't look like. He understood what he understood what it meant to fight for democracy and what was at risk if you lost the fight. The British were serious about hanging on to their empire. If you lose that, firing squad or a news, take your pick, but you're not going to get out of here alive. So they had no choice but to win that fight against the British government. And because they had dealt with the worst of royal governors who were corrupt, in a colonial system, which is always inherently corrupt. That's what colonization is all about. If somebody skimming off the top, they knew about that, the foibles and weaknesses and limitations of human beings. James Madison, one of his contemporaries, said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Can I inform you of something? Men are not angels. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And then he went on to add, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed. In other words, while the foxes are watching the hen house, who's watching the foxes? And in the context place, and in the next place, oblige it to govern, to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. In other words, no matter how many roadblocks you put in here, no matter how many contingencies we put in here. And I once heard somebody say that NASA is famous for this. NASA has a plan B, then plan B1A, then plan B2B, plan B2C. And NASA has layers and layers of contingencies because you know why? It's like they told us at the aircraft company. There's no such thing as a second bad landing. So it's got to be right the first time. So you have to build in safety precautions, to back up safety precautions, to back up safety precautions. Likewise, with a democratic decentralized government. They built it into the Constitution, or they tried to, using the understanding of human nature that they had at the time, using their understanding of a democratic republic at the time. I don't know, I'm pretty sure, I want to believe that the founding fathers never envisioned a day when people in America would be so disinterested in being informed and maintaining their own government that they would simply just leave it up to people that say, give it to me, I'll fix it. Now, precedent is an event that has already happened. Has the Capitol been assaulted before? Yes, it has. One time, some say the first time was in the War of 1812 when the British burned it down. Dolly Addison, the wife of the president, thank God, she had enough presence of mind to take the nation's treasures, and with the slave, she took that stuff out of there and saved much of the nation's early treasures. Second time was during the Civil War. In the summer of 1864, General Robert E. Lee, the Supreme Commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, dispatched his Lieutenant, Jubal Anderson Early. Lee was defending Richmond at the time and was ordered to hold in place. But he figured he could buy himself some time by sending Early to raid Washington, knowing that the politicians, always prepared to be afraid, would be fighting out of their mind. He wasn't wrong. Jubal Anderson Early got to within 7 miles of Washington, D.C. before he was stopped at Fort Stevens, just outside of the city. But during that raid, keep in mind, during that raid, the Confederate flag never, ever, ever made it into the nation's capital, not the Congress. The third time was 9/11, when the raiders on that day tried to decapitate the government in addition to blowing up the World Trade Center. Then on January 6, 2021, the Confederate flag, it took the 21st century for someone to finally bring the Confederate flag, the flag of traitors and treason, into the nation's house. You know, that's my house too. So it couldn't get inside that house during 4 years of civil conflict. I mean, 4 years of outright warfare. The Civil War wasn't just a civil war, it was the world's first modern war. So whatever it was domestically, it was outright true warfare. Real killing, real shooting, real misery, real refugees, real cholera, real dysentery, real. That we're getting wrong now. How do we get here? How do we get here? Well, scholars of HASP, I submit to you I would like to assert to you that answers to those questions are deeply rooted in the trends of our history, American history. I'd first like to submit to you that if you look for trends in history, one is that this nation, like many nations, our nation has a tradition of violence, mob violence. Second, we have a tradition or a history where people feel entitled to commit violence. An entitlement to violence. An entitlement to wage violence on certain people, different groups of people, or just to be violent. There's been a tolerance for injustice. a history of violence, and then a tradition of a tolerance of violence, a tolerance for injustice, an entitlement to violence. That may be hard to hear at first pass, it may be unbelievable. Let me continue. Tolerance for injustice. And then a long, long history where people who are violent and feel entitled to commit violence and have a tolerance for injustice suffer no consequences. For those of you who remember the case about maybe a year ago, I guess it's been a year ago now, when the three men that ran down Ahmaud Arbery, that young black man that was running through his neighborhood just jogging, and three guys flew up on him and shot him and killed him in broad daylight because they thought he was running through the wrong neighborhood. First of all, who appointed them the welcoming committee is anybody's guess. But when you look at, if you can go back and look at their faces in court that day, when they were finally sentenced for murdering this guy, they had looks of utter stun on their face. Like, what? This is really happening? Yes. You killed somebody and you're going to jail. They never thought that they would actually have to do time for that. That's what I interpreted. Like, why not? Well, as long as it's murder, how is this different? Or is he somehow not a human being to you? Or, you know, he's a human being, but he's one of those human beings. So therefore you, who have a history of violence and feel entitled to violence and never suffer any consequences, now you're doing that? You think that somehow there's something that the wheels will come off the wagon? No. This one time, in this one place, justice is finally doing its work. That's the good news. That's the good news. The bad news is that it took so long. No consequences for harassment, intimidation when it came to voting, buying a home, getting a loan. I mean, you know, this goes on. When I was looking to buy a house in Holland, I wouldn't even bother telling you all some of the places that the real estate agents took me. I said, what? Are you serious? Well, you know, this is where we thought you might like this. What made you think I would like this? And I said, oh, okay, right. U.S. history. So all that, a culture of violence, a tolerance for an entitlement to violence, and a tolerance for injustice leads to a culture of impunity. A culture of impunity. I can do this to you and never worry about suffering the consequences. I can do this to you. I can do a thing. How can I get it in my head that let's kidnap the governor? They won't catch us. If they do, nothing will happen to us. How do you reach that conclusion, really? Unless you really think you can get away with it. What makes you think you can get away with kidnapping a sitting governor? I don't care if it's a Democratic governor or a Republican governor or an independent governor, someone who's been elected by the people in a democracy. What makes you think that's a good idea? Unless you're a fascist country or totalitarian country. And so in putting this together and trying to figure this out, I said what we have been dealing with is a system we have in America, historically a democratic republic that has made room for pockets of tyranny. It is possible to have a country that is a democratic republic, and we do, but like this chair here or anywhere else, the chair is in the larger reality. This chair is a small piece of territory in the larger reality of this room. The larger reality of the room is democratic republic, but right here is an island of tyranny. And what goes on in an island of tyranny? The things that go on in an island of tyranny, where people are harassed, intimidated, have their civil rights violated, voting rights suppressed or not exercised. Over there, it doesn't happen, but everything else happens in there, but not for the folk in there. Do you understand what I'm saying? In the beginning, we made a devil's bargain at the writing of the Constitution, and also at the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And that devil's bargain was in the aspirational language. It is illogical. It is problematic, at a minimum, to be uttering the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, while you're actively engaged in denying men basic fundamental liberties of never mind civil rights, just freedom, period, or whatever level they can experience it. How do you balance that? Can you balance that? Talk about having two thoughts in your head at the same time. How do you pull that trick off? I'm a fight for independence for everybody else except that island of tyranny right there. Or, more specifically, how do you practice tyranny at the same time that you're practicing liberty? That takes a real sleight of hand. You got to be a magician to do that. At the Constitutional Convention, ironically enough, called because in 1786, a former Revolutionary War officer, Daniel Shays, who had fought all during the Revolution, then went back home to Western Massachusetts. And because the colonies, the former colonies, still owed the British lots and lots of money, the British were very intent on gathering their debts. The states of Massachusetts and the former colonies had to tax people, and if you couldn't pay your taxes, they would confiscate your land, your animals. In other words, since everybody back in the 1786 is probably doing farming, some kind of agriculture, to take your land and your animals, you can't live. They took the land of the agriculture, they took the land of the animals, usually through the courts. So Daniel Shays said, you know what, he's going to lead a rebellion. So they attacked the courts first. Why? Because that's where all the injustice was taking place. Shut down the courts, no more judgment. So this former army officer who had fought against the British, then fought against the Massachusetts state government. The governor of Massachusetts called for some help from nearby states and went, look, I feel your pain, but not my problem. It's not happening in Pennsylvania. It's not happening in Connecticut. It's not happening in New York. It's happening in Massachusetts. So handle your business. Well, he couldn't handle his business. Other people who were good, smart enough to see which way the wind was blowing, said, we don't arrest this. If a bunch of white farmers can do this and upset this, what happens if a bunch of highly motivated black people decide to rebel? Then we will have a problem. So they decide that they need to have a meeting in Annapolis. Not enough people showed up, which was really too bad because the seafood in Annapolis is great. So they switched the meeting to Philadelphia for the spring and summer of 1787. And from May through September 1787, they looked at the Articles of Confederation and said, this just is not working, even in its updated form. We got to do something different. So they decided to write a new document. Didn't tell anybody about it, and they called it the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. But while they were writing this thing, as the ink was drying, there was already some ill winds blowing. Because the devil's bargain made in 1787 was this. In 1787, who's we? We did not include Native Americans. We did not include poor white people. I have to remind my students of that because, the country's had a struggle with not just enfranchising people, but there have been times in our history, in American history, where people came from the wrong part of Europe. Greece, Serbia, Eastern Europe. You can come from the wrong part of Europe and not be really considered American. If you're Irish Catholic, you're not from the right part of Europe. So poor whites, women were not considered we. And black people, absolutely not. So how do you do that? How do you go from we the people, freedom and democracy, to actually enshrining slavery? The Constitution did that in 3 separate areas. So the devil's bargain was made one more time. The devil's bargain, which was an agreement with violence, an entitlement to violence, an intolerance of injustice, because the way the slavery got into the Constitution was that they had to compromise. A compromise means that there's been a disagreement about something and people have reached an agreement to it, or as I like to put it, everybody agrees to it, everybody gets what they want, but nobody's happy about it. Made a compromise with slavery, and so it was embedded, baked into the document. That was how you get tyranny in the form of one chair inside of a democratic republic, and you put it side by side so that it may not be everywhere, but it doesn't need to be everywhere, just for the folk there. So tyranny was a living What was that tyranny originally? That tyranny originally was called slavery. Now, it turns out that that's just one aspect of it, because it also involved Irish Catholics when they came. They experienced a form of tyranny. You know that debate about Irish Catholics today in the updated form of immigration. Choose whatever group coming to America right now, swap out the names and plug in theirs, and you get the same song and dance. Tyranny is made for Jews to harass them, anti-Semitism in America. A tolerance for injustice, an entitlement to be violent toward Irish Catholics, toward Jews, and most recently, toward Asians. John J. Chapman said, there was never a moment during this time when the slavery issue was not a sleeping serpent. That issue lay coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. That is a scary, scary thought. It was there the whole time, just waiting for someone to disturb it, waiting to strike out and bite the nation. And then if you really want to make the formula complete, what formula of tyranny and oppression and injustice and intolerance could be complete without, I'm be very careful here, not Christianity, but the religious component? Understand there's a difference between religion and Christianity. Frederick Douglass, in speaking on this, reflecting on this, said, I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Frederick Douglass, having been a slave, then escaped a slave, then having to flee to England to raise money to finally pay off the guy that still claimed his labor, Frederick Douglass had no trouble drawing a line of demarcation between the people that were Christians of Christ and then whatever's going on in America, they call it Christianity. So there's Christ over here, then this other thing that says one thing, it does another. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I can contemplate the religious pomp and show together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. This man was from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. He traveled all over the country, probably the most famous person in the 19th century, aside from Abraham Lincoln. So scholars have asked, the question that I had then was, how does tyranny coexist side by side? Comfortably. In an American Democratic Republic, not, with dissonance. There's some friction here and there, but it exists comfortably. By Abraham Lincoln's count, in 1865, when he gives the second inaugural, on March 4th, 1865, started from 1619, he will say 265 years. As of that date, the second inaugural, March 4th. And the Civil War, although a few weeks still away, on March 4th, he doesn't know there's only a few weeks from ending. If you go to 1820, just to show how this thing had metastasized and grown, how the cancer had spread, when Missouri applied for statehood in the Union in 1820, the tyranny was working there too. And there was another need to maintain the tyranny. So another devil's bargain was made to maintain slavery, where Thomas Jefferson, then retired from the presidency, with his friend John Holmes, and complained that regarding the slavery issue, he put it like this. He used a fantastic analogy. He said, we have the wolf by the ears. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. As I said to my students, now if you hold a wolf by the ears, several things begin to happen. Here's the wolf, going like this. Now the first thing that happens is this hurts your back. The other thing too is you have to ask the question: if you're holding the wolf, it would have been one thing if he said we have the wolf by the ears and we can't hold him nor let him go. But he qualified. He said we can't safely let him go. So who's got who? Do you have the wolf? Or does the wolf have you? You got to hold on to it. In other words, there came a point where we held on to it, and then we couldn't let it go. We couldn't let it go for our own safety. We couldn't let it go. When they finally tried to, it ended up being a 4-year civil war. And the Civil War came. and then it ended. Then there was 12 years of Reconstruction, where they tried to do the right thing, passing the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, the 14th Amendment that dealt with due process, dual citizenship, equal protection of the laws, and the 15th Amendment that gave only Black men the right to vote, sadly, only men. But that experiment failed. And do the math on this one. Even I can do the math on this one. 246 years of slavery and 12 years of Reconstruction. That is not enough to break an addictive habit called oppression. By the time you get to the 20th century, the 13th Amendment has been denied and ignored. The 14th Amendment has been denied and ignored. You got the rise of Jim Crow segregation, the rise of a peonage system in the South called sharecropping. You have the rise in the North of actual segregation, not virtual, but segregation in a different kind of way. And of course, the vote. Southerners call Southerners many things, but never call them stupid. They knew that the pathway to power was through the ballot box. So they did whatever they could to make sure that access to that facility was denied to Black people. And just in case there was anybody remaining who thought they still should have the right to vote, there was a domestic terrorist arm to ensure that if you didn't know your place, they're here to remind you in very lethal, sometimes mortal ways. Founded in 1866, I keep on thinking about all the gifts that Tennessee gives us. Most recently, Tennessee gave us, 2 ousted Black legislators. Tennessee gave us Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Tennessee gave us Andrew Johnson, the bigoted governor during Reconstruction. Tennessee gave us the Ku Klux Klan founded in 1866. Yay, Tennessee. And because of that tradition of violence and entitlement to violence and a tolerance for injustice and a culture of impunity, people who intended to deny folk the vote felt entitled to use violence, could do it with impunity. And why could they do it with impunity? Because when they denied people the right to vote, nothing happened to them. Nothing. That's called enabling. When people have no fear of being prosecuted, guess what they do? Because we are broken individuals, we do it again and again and again. So Reconstruction, whatever gains it had, and there were some, there they went. Then there was the introduction of a big lie in 1915. This is why I tell people when folks say, can you believe XYZ? Yes, I can believe it. Or I just can't believe such and such a thing happened. Why can you not believe it? D.W. Griffith in his film, Birth of a Nation, told this fantastic lie about Reconstruction, about Black men, essentially white men dressed in blackface who are running roughshod over poor defeated Southerners and hiding behind trees and leering at, dainty white women like the only thing that they didn't do is just, put the very pile of hands up, they're dripping with blood or whatnot. You could not miss the message, that we got to protect our Southern white womanhood. These people are out of control. We told you they were better off as slaves. Things were better before. What does the poor South to do? The solution was a Ku Klux Klan. After this guy is actually a white actor, like I said, in blackface. They figured the best way to restore order in the South was for these riders of the night to take on their horses and reestablish the order that the South knew beforehand. Translation, these were better before emancipation. Now think back to a few years ago when Trent Lott, the former senator from Mississippi, said, when Strom Thurmond's 100th birthday, Trent Lott said, if you had won the election in 1948, we wouldn't have all these problems. What do you mean, Trent? Like voting? You mean like not getting lynched? Come on, Trent, brother. What do you mean? D.W. Griffith's film, track with me slowly here, a movie, a story, a fictional tale based on an actual historical event. A fictionalized story based on an historical event called Reconstruction, a movie, a piece of artwork translated into a real movement called the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. The movie came out in 1915. The Ku Klux Klan that had done its job and winning the cultural war. Black people are pulled back into the shadows, too afraid to vote. Segregation was a real thing. They won the battle. The Civil War, for many people, might have been fought for nothing from the African American point of view. Yes, free, thankful for that, but the first class citizenship still very far away. They won the battle, and yet somehow a guy telling a lie led to the recreation, the rebirth of this. And just to make sure we understand, that building in the back is called the U.S. Congress, where representatives go to represent us. So if in fact the domestic terrorist organization is marching down, when I say domestic terrorism, I mean terrorism like, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, use whatever one will fit your needs. Terrorism is terrorism, domestic and or foreign born. Domestic terrorists marching in the shadow of the nation's house with the people inside there. If they know they're outside, I can only conclude that people inside that house know that domestic terrorists are marching outside, and they say, we know that, we know what they're doing, we're okay with that. If they know that, my question is, do the people that sent you there know that you feel that way? Chances are we're very much that way. The people that sent those folks to be in that house to represent us, they know they're domestic terrorists marching outside, and they're okay with it too. Should we be surprised that there was a culture of impunity and a tolerance for violence? No. We're not going to be naive and think that people didn't know. So what happened throughout the 1920s? In one case, in the state of Indiana, the Ku Klux Klan took over state government. And by the way, they were pretty active in Michigan too. And still are. Every now and then, one of my students is going to say, Professor Johnson, I thought you wanted to hear this. You know, the Ku Klux Klan is still active in Michigan. And I'd say, what made you think I wanted to hear that? August 7th, 1930, Marion, Indiana, is a very infamous, I won't say famous, infamous picture of the lynching of A. Smith and Tommy Shipp. Look, this is not to engage in violence porn, but to say that what's going on in this picture, beyond the violence, beyond the people hanging in the tree, they're real simple. A. Smith and Tommy Shipp are dead. The real story is what's happening on the ground beneath them. How do you gather in 1930, which is not 1730 or 1630 or 1530, but 1930, that is 20th century, the thing we left just a few years ago. How do you gather these two very dead bodies in a tree? And by the way, the tree is right outside the courthouse, the Hall of Justice in Marion, Indiana. How do you gather at nighttime? It looks like there's men and women out there, so it's not one type, one thing where one gender is more violent than the other. They're both young and old out there, so it appears to be across generations about where this can happen. How do you explain all these people being gathered for what looks like a family reunion photo at the scene of a double homicide? Could it be that these people are coming from a nation where there's been a history of violence, an entitlement to violence, a tolerance for injustice, and a culture of impunity? Could it be that whatever's happening out there that night, whatever they're thinking, they know because of that culture of impunity that no one will be held accountable? Could it be that the same thought process operating in them led another group of people to think we can kidnap a governor and get away with it, or send the Capitol and get away with that? Could it do that? Well, whatever it is, they don't appear to be too worried about being called in front of a grand jury. Scholars of HASP, we have to ask ourselves this question. What is the consequence of no consequences? A Republican democracy operates because, for whatever degree of efficiency and wellness that it does, because we all agree to abide by the rules in place. Individually, 330 million of us have to agree to abide by the rules. So that when an election occurs and somebody wins and somebody loses, the loser makes a concession speech, goes back and says, you know what? I'll do better next time, or maybe I won't try again. You don't win a baseball game or a football game and beat up the ref. because you lost. You go back and work harder. Make your case to the people in a democracy. The consequence of no consequences are you get more injustice. You expand the culture of impunity. And you invite murder. As in the case of what happened in the 1930s with the rise of this organization in the Detroit area. The Black Legion was founded by a dentist in Southern Ohio. When I first found that out, I said, what's going on with the dentists? But this doctor in Southern Ohio felt that the Ku Klux Klan was not being radical enough in its suppression of Black people and immigrants. This is in the 1920s, so it's after World War I. Lots of immigrants coming from Germany, coming from Italy, coming from Southern Europe. Too many of the wrong kind of people coming into America, taking our jobs and, diminishing our American way of life, blah, blah, blah. So the Ku Klux Klan is going to be reactivated. We're going to give them a branch to deal with these people. And they had a real strange ritual in the Black Legion. By the way, Humphrey Bogart actually made a movie about the Black Legion. It wasn't very good, but it's sort of his career. But it's Hollywood, so it's over the top. But it gives you something of an overshadowing of who these people were. But dragging you out, you couldn't just go, knock on the door and say, I want to join you guys. You had to be selected by somebody to be inducted into their little organization. And yes, they wore these pirate suits. Now, let me caution you again, just because they look ridiculous, they're very serious about what they were doing. Say what you want about grown men to get dressed up in pirate outfits and gather together at night. What they were doing when they gathered together was very serious business. And again, if you're that Irish Catholic person, you're that Jew, you can't afford to not take these guys seriously. They were against Jews. They were against Catholics. They were against immigrants of all types. They were absolutely and obviously, as always, against Black people. Their oath included things like this. Do you believe in white supremacy and that no Negro should have authority over a white man? Do you believe in restricted immigration and deportation of all undesirable aliens? If you're listening close enough, a lot of this sounds like there's a distant echo that sounds very resonant today. Would you oppose by ballot and if necessary by force of arms any attempt to place any portion of the public tax money in the hands of the Roman Catholic Church? If it should ever become necessary to lie to protect a member of this organization, would you do so? In other words, if it ever became necessary to lie to protect us, to ruin this democracy, would you be willing to do that? What is your attitude toward lynch law? Can I say that somebody has to ask you what's your attitude toward lynch law? The mere fact they're asking you that question is a problem. So they went into this guy, Charles Poole. On May 12th, 1936, Charles Poole looks like a regular white guy, but Charles Poole had a problem. Charles Poole was Catholic. He was a labor organizer for the Roosevelt administration. It's 1936. The Great Depression is still on. He worked for the Works Progress Administration, one of Roosevelt's alphabet projects, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, NRA, the National Recovery Act. Charles Poole was married to Becky, his beautiful wife, their young child. But Becky was a Protestant woman. They heard a rumor that Charles Poole, the Catholic man, was abusing his Protestant wife, so they decided to teach him a lesson. And they murdered Charles Poole. Only to find out later on that, oops, he hadn't been beating up on his wife at all. They were eventually arrested, and the grip of the Black Legion was finally broken. They didn't go away completely, but it was broken in the areas outside of Detroit. They did have control of some county governments outside the city. So they had made it into the halls of power. These guys were running stuff for a minute. This is why whenever I hear somebody saying, can you believe that so-and-so just said this? Yes, I can believe it. My question here is this. You don't understand. Every time you keep on being surprised that they can go lower and lower and lower, it tells me that you don't understand that this is what they do. Their MO is going, that the cruelty is the point. It's not how cruel can I be. The cruelty, that's the catnip that they inhale, that they consume. What is the point then? The point is that, like James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor external controls on government would be necessary. We have allowed, we have tolerated, at times in our history, islands of tyranny inside the United States. There are different instances where it flares up. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. The Black Wall Street is burned to the ground. Colfax, 1866. Chicago, 1919. East St. Louis, 1917. Lynchings. In the community where these people live, it doesn't matter if you have been screaming to the heavens that we live in a democratic democracy. The point of the matter is that the people that live here, they don't live in that democracy. They live in a state of tyranny. For them, intimidation, terror, murder, lynching, extralegal activity, vigilante justice from the outside in, that's their reality inside the Democratic Republic. Doesn't really matter what's going on out there. Good for you out there. But the question is, as I told people, I've always known they're coming after me, but now it sounds like they're coming after everybody. Now what? The point is, the culture of impunity has survived and has metastasized. So now people think that they can actually get away with kidnapping a sitting governor or storm the US Capitol. How do we know that they think they can do that? Because they did it. They tried it. And seemed utterly surprised that they were captured and brought to book or brought to account for it. I mentioned to you all at the end of yesterday's last session that what Herman Wouk wrote in his book, The Will to Not Believe, I think that the flip side of that is the will to believe. The will to not believe. Millions of European Jews, millions of German Jews, we just thought, oh, he's just another guy. You know, they come along every now and then. They saw this wild stuff. And of course, you know, it's uncomfortable, but then they get in power, then they die down, they get what they want, then they go ahead and do what they do and leave us alone. Well, this time was different. This guy was different. But Herman Wouk again asked the question, why after it became necessary? You know, after the opening of Dachau in 1933, after Kristallnacht in 1938, when they burned synagogues and tore up Jewish homes and businesses, surely that would have convinced people. No, they still chose to hang on and believe that it would die down, that they would never take it to that level where it clearly was going. And in spite of what their own eyes were telling them, many chose to stay. So they couldn't get out. Likewise, the flip side of that, in spite of what many saw with their own eyes, they chose to believe a big lie. In spite of what many chose to see with their own eyes, Reconstruction had occurred in a different kind of way than the way D. Deborah Griffith told it, but they chose to believe it was on the screen instead of what had been written in the books of what they see with their own eyes. The will to not believe is offset by the will to believe. And if you believe that Black people, in the case of D. Deborah Griffith's Birth of a Nation, are a corrupt, inherently criminal, indecent, undeserving of first-class citizenship group of people who need to be controlled and kept in their place, then maybe you do put on a sheet in the hood and make sure that happens based on the story, because that's what you choose to believe, all evidence to the contrary. The consequence of no consequences lead to requirements like General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a future president. And I don't know what made General Eisenhower conclude this or think this, but I'm glad he did. He must have known about this will to not believe, but more specifically, the will to believe. When he visited Ordre, Buchenwald in 1945, liberating the camp, Eisenhower had gone there because some of his other generals, Omar Nelson Bradley and George Patton, had gone there and seen the camp. And Patton had written him some of the most unbelievable stuff. Now, this is George S. Patton, old blood and guts, Pearl handle revolvers, 3rd Armored Division, the guy that, was supposed to be Mr. Warfare. Patton had gone there and seen what what the Nazis had done to Jews and other people, and it left him sick to his stomach. Patton was not a man unfamiliar with death, carnage, and warfare. But what he saw there left him disturbed. He wrote to Eisenhower and begged him, you got to come see this for yourself. So Eisenhower was boss back in Washington, George Marshall, the guy that McCarthy will eventually be accusing one day of being a communist. He said, General Marshall, one of the most interesting, although horrible sights that I encountered during the trip was a visit to a German concentration camp near Gotha. The things I saw beg a description. That's 1945 language for you won't believe what I've seen here. I've seen it myself. I've seen it with myself. I can barely believe it myself. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates and by one trick or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence of the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. What I heard, not what I saw, because if you ever smelled a dead body or a dead dog or a dead anything, the stench will make you retch. Eisenhower was saying that what I heard with my ears left me nauseated. They went on to say, General Marshall, in one room where they were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. General Patton, old blood and guts, would even go in there. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things, if ever in the future. And there it is. There's the point, scholars of Haas. Eisenhower said, I went in there myself to see for myself. I failed to include in this presentation where he said that he also wrote back to Washington, telling senators and congressmen and journalists to come to Gorge Rivers as fast as they could, bring their cameras, bring their notebooks to write down. So like to give and to make the visit deliberately, I went in there myself in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things. If ever in the future there develops a tendency, there comes a time when there'll be people who want to deny the Holocaust. At a minimum, they can't tell me what I didn't see. He's saying, send the photographers, send the record keepers, send the chroniclers, so they can write this down. Somebody somewhere is going to look at this tragedy of human existence and say it didn't happen. They're going to choose to believe a big lie, despite 6 million dead people. What will it take? Now, in conversation with one of our colleagues, it suddenly struck me that the documentary about George Wallace's life, is in part, not completely, but is in part an answer to how such people rise. It turns out that George Wallace, I grew up at a time when George Wallace, my family is from Alabama, my mother and my father. So let's just say that George Wallace, usually when that name came up, it was, sprinkled with some very colorful language. But George Wallace was not always the person he was. He at one time was called a liberal or moderate judge, but he made a decision to do some other things for power. Now, this is after George Wallace, the first time he ran for governor, he wanted to be governor more than anything in the world, and he lost. He lost to a guy that ran, according to getting Ku Klux Klan help, It's Alabama. It's the 1950s. So the guy that ran as a Klansman, he won. And George Wallace was not happy about that.
58, the middle ground had disappeared. Wallace's opponent had other ideas. John Patterson, the state's attorney general, had used the courts to drive civil rights activists out of Alabama. He approved of the death sentence for a black man convicted of stealing $1.95 from a white woman. And Patterson left no doubt where he stood on integration.
Once you let the bar down, it's all over. And I'm not for token integration or any kind of integration. And I think that some of the people in the state who've been advocating token integration have already sold us out before the fight even starts.
John Patterson was my cousin. My mother was a Patterson. And John Patterson's father was a very fine man. And John Patterson, I think, was a perfectly intelligent person. But he ran for governor on the most racist platform you have ever seen in your life. It's just as racist as you can possibly be.
Just before the election, a newspaper exposed close connections between Patterson's campaign and the Ku Klux Klan. In the past, that alliance would have cost a candidate the votes of moderates. But in Alabama in 1958, the middle ground had disappeared.
And I want to tell the good people of this state, as a judge of the Third Judicial Circuit, if I didn't have what it took to treat a man fair, regardless of his color, then I don't have what it takes to be the governor of your great state.
The final runoff wasn't even close. Patterson was swept to victory. Wallace was devastated, his lifelong dreams shattered.
It's one of the few times in Wallace's career that he didn't really understand what the people were thinking. He knew segregation was an issue, but he did not realize that it was the tough, mean issue that it was in 1958.
1958 was a turning point for George Wallace. The defeat would change him, the future of Alabama, and the political landscape of the entire country.
George Wallace, with his keen political antenna, understood immediately why he had lost. And I think he decided at that point that he would exploit race to the extent it took necessary, that he considered it necessary to win.
And in doing that, he made a Faustian bargain. He, the one-time progressive, decided to sell his soul for the governorship. And he could never turn back on that fully.
George Wallace came back to the district after the defeat, back to our county, and he asked me would I come over to his office and talk with him. So I did, and he said, "Seymour, you know why I lost that governor's race?" I said, "I'm not sure, Judge. What do you think?" He said, "Seymour, I was out-niggered by John Patterson, and I'll tell you here and now, I will never be out-niggered again."
So leadership has to sell its soul for power, not democracy, for power. I've been telling people that for the last 4 years, most of the issues are race, class, climate, anything. I've been very worried about the survival of this Republican democracy. You understand that the people that are out to turn this thing on its head, they're not worried about none of that stuff. Gender issues, transgender issues, climate issues, race issues, economic issues, they're in it for power, their own power. I'm of the belief that whatever your pet project is, It only can get some airtime in discussion if you have a democracy that has the room to discuss these things. FDR's four freedoms, 1941, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. If you don't have a democracy, you are fearful of all those things. You don't have the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and you're fearful of one, and fearful of fear. Everything. So George Wallace made that Faustian bargain. You know the story of Dr. Faustus, who wanted a few more years of life. So he gave his soul to Mephistopheles as a bargain with the devil. When the time came to pay the bill, well, of course, Dr. Faustus wasn't ready. All of a sudden, then he wanted Christ. But the devil reached up from hell and literally prevented him from uttering the word Christ because he wanted that soul, that valuable, ever sweet tasting, delicious soul of his. And Faustus had given it up for a few years of being able to do tricks, entertaining dukes, earls, and lords. So George Wallace went on and he won the governorship at a price.
The American Experience, winner of the Primetime Emmy. He was the most influential loser in American politics.
About segregation. Now let me ask you this. How in the name of common sense can you be too strong about it? You're either for it or you're against it. They're not in the middle ground as I know of.
In the early 60s, civil rights sit-ins and integrated freedom bus rides spread all across the South. Angry reaction from whites added more fuel to the Wallace fire.
He knew that he could not stop immigration, but he knew that that was the issue and the one issue that he could win on.
People ask me a lot of times, was Wallace a racist? Now, was he a Ku Kluxer? No. Did he get up every morning and say, let me go find some black folks so I can lynch them? No, he wasn't that. And he would not have favored those who felt, and there were those who felt that way. But he could be perfectly reasonable in a conversation with a black person. And he could leave in the next 10 minutes, deliver the most racist appeal that you've ever heard in pursuit of votes.
In that time, those days, people didn't want Negroes to be upgraded. And that's why he hollered. That's why he said, nigger, 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 because he knew, you know, the white people was against Negroes and he wanted to be against Negroes so he could be elected.
Say, who are you gonna vote for governor? George Wallace, of course. Isn't everybody?
The majority of the people in the state of Alabama like what he was saying. And that's the white people.
Who are you voting for governor? George Wallace, isn't everybody?
It won him the race.
When Election Day in 1962 arrived, Wallace won in a record landslide.
The part of the world where I grew up, they'd been waiting for a champion for a long time. And Wallace...
Words branded in history with the name George Wallace.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
What he was talking about was locking into place forever a system in which, in my own county, only 150 black folk out of 15,000 were registered to vote, and each one of these had to be vouched for by a white person. If some white person didn't say Old Ned was all right, Old Ned didn't get registered. And here was Wallace on the television saying he's going to lock that in place forever.
When Wallace turned to the politics of race, one of his supporters, who was horrified, said, "George, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" And Wallace, sadly, he thought, said, "You know, I tried to talk about good roads and good schools and all these things that have been part of my career, and nobody listened. And then I began talking about niggers, and they stomped the floor."
So George Wallace knew what he was doing. He did it in the name of power. I tried to talk about schools and good roads. Nobody wanted to hear that. On the one hand, we can blame George Wallace, but on the other hand, there were the people that wanted to hear the stuff that he did choose to talk about. They were out there waiting for someone to say that. They're called voters. They're called voters. George Wallace was just one man with one megaphone. There's not thousands of people voting for him, but thousands of people did, again and again. So for McCarthyism today, in whatever form that it takes, and it's in the current form of one aspect, a big lie, my conclusion is that there is no bottom. I am deeply impatient with people that keep saying stuff like, "Can you believe that for the final time?" Yes, I can believe it. The cruelty is the point. There's nothing I don't think that they won't do that can go low enough. There's always some new lower level to get to. How do we know that? Because they keep going, they keep reaching for it. I also know this, straight from the playbook of the Marvel Comics universe. It's fiction, it's fantasy, but there's an element of truth to what Loki says. But more than that, the man that stands up, who I guess he's supposed to be a survivor of a concentration camp.
before me. I said, is not this simpler? Is this not your natural state? It's the unspoken truth of humanity that you crave subjugation. The bright lure of freedom diminishes your life's joy in a mad scramble for power, for identity. You were made to be ruled. In the end, you will always kneel.
Not to men like you.
There are no men like me.
There are always men like you.
And that's my point. There is no bottom, and there will always be men like that. Always. Before George Wallace, they were called Theodore Bilbo, governor of Mississippi, or Vardaman of Mississippi, or Jefferson Davis, or Robert Barnwell Rhett, or Lester Maddox. There's going to be another one. So like the inscription says in front of the National Archives building, the price of liberty, freedom is constant vigilance. There will always be another person, man or woman like that, always. The spirit of the crucifixion lives in us. Only some of us have enough daring to carry it out. The danger ahead, what the first president warned us about. There is no bottom. There will always be men like this, men and women like this. So what are we to do in a democratic republic? The first president gave us a blueprint, a way to watch out for this. In his farewell address, George Washington said, in contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of the other districts. George Washington was terrified of political parties and factions. He said, you cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. Translation, people that ought to be friends and brothers and sisters united in a democratic democracy are torn apart because strangers at each other's throats because of what? Factionalism and segmentation, tribalism. Such is where we are right now. Divisiveness towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state. It is requisite. I recommend not only that you steadily discountenance irregular opposition, that is, that you disarm irregular oppositions to its acknowledged authority, but you also resist with care the spirit of in other words, you look very carefully at all the people that will be out there looking at probing around the edges to find a way to get inside your system and turning it on itself. However specious the pretext, illogical, unsubstantiated arguments and reasoning, also known as lies, big lies. One method of assault may be to effect in the form of the Constitution. One method of assault may be to use the Constitution itself in alterations which will impair the energy of the system, that is, to take the system and use the system to disrupt itself, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown, bit by bit, bite by bite, cancerous cell by cancerous cell, to take the Constitution and make it eat itself like a cancer. But only you can do that. That's what he says, watch very carefully for people that try to do this through specious, innovative trickery. One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. This is inscribed on the outside of the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I promise you, every time I went downtown to do research as an undergrad, I went down there a lot just to see this. I would stop in front of this thing and stare at it and just look at it and try to, in that 19-year-old mind, what does this mean? I was on my way to being commissioned as an officer candidate in the Marine Corps, and I would wonder, what does this mean? For what I'm about to do with my life, what does this mean for me? What's at stake, scholars of Haas, is a clear and present danger to our democracy. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get to microphone too. This is being recorded.
John?
Okay, good. Remember, I was given a book by the German Book Society, 1960s. It said Dwight Eisenhower was a conscious, dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy, which is ridiculous. I actually gave a sermon about that.
Right.
Unfortunately, she walked down. Okay.
Given that it came from the John Birch Society, I'm not at all surprised. They the John Birch Society, which was considered to be, well, extremists back then, people have said that today they have become the mainstream, their views.
Listening the last 3 weeks really made me think a lot about how I grew up. And I grew up in Boston, in the inner city, in the 60s and 70s, in a racially mixed neighborhood, which is highly unusual in Boston. And Boston has a reputation of being a very racist city, and it is true. It is absolutely true. Whether it's more racist than other cities, I don't know, but it is a very racist city. And one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking, I think to some extent, like I said, I grew up in a mixed neighborhood. I had Jewish friends and neighbors, Black friends and neighbors, Catholic friends and neighbors. And I think, what you described is there's a lot of exploitation, I think, then and today, about fears that people have. I mean, it's maybe in my area that I grew up is maybe different than the South, but I think things that people were worried about was, oh, these people are going to take our jobs. It was an economic fear that people have. And I think that's still the same, the same things are being exploited. The fears that people have are being exploited. And I think to some extent that people who have power, people who have money, they want to cause us to have more fears so that we're distracted. We're not paying attention to what they're doing. If we're looking at our neighbors and saying, hey, they want to take something from me that I think I'm going to lose, instead of us working together to pay attention to what is really going on, we're distracted. That's kind of one of the things I was thinking. Maybe that's part of what's happening, why it's happening.
It's so easy because we as human beings, we are natural. We are. What do you think is, by God gifted design or by natural evolutionary process? We are wired to experience fear. It can be very helpful. If you're in a bad part of town or you're about to be threatened, fear can get some adrenaline moving to help you save yourself, to run, right? Not to go walking into a lion cage at feeding time and like, oh, nothing wrong here. But so we're naturally predisposed to be fearful. And because we are, there are people like the George Wallaces of the world who, knowing that they shouldn't, against their own better judgment, like George Wallace, will take those kind of fears that people either know to have or through experience have had, and will exploit them for whatever benefit, whatever purpose they see as being valid at the moment. It's not an accident that in January 1933, Adolf Hitler was asked to be the Chancellor of Germany, and in February, the Reichstag burned down. The following month, it blamed it on a Jew, a Dutch Jewish guy. Okay? Now, anti-Semitism already had a long history in Germany. So Reichstag burned down, this guy did it. Well, you already have a history of anti-Semitism. He just burned down the equivalent of your Parliament building. And then the following month, in March, they put up Dachau, the first concentration camp that became the model for the rest of them. So in 90 days from taking office, this guy's got one Reichstag that's in rubble, smoking rubble, and a concentration camp that's a template for the rest of them. How did that happen? Fear. And by targeting that guy, Jews always being looked at as being the other, odd, kind of scurrilous people, and you blame it on them, and you just harness all that power, and then it just turned into a rushing stream that at some point became unstoppable. In the United States, fears in the 1960s even of the Catholics. And had people asking this question about John F. Kennedy. Will he be more subservient to the Catholic Church or to the U.S. Constitution? As if a man of faith couldn't do both at the same time, serve his church while still being faithful to the Constitution and carrying out his duties as Commander-in-Chief of the United States. Well, people still ask that question a mere 60 some odd years ago. And likewise, in World War II, when Mexican nationals were asked to come to America, we had a population of what, about 150 million people, 12 million men and women were in uniform. And because 12 million men and women were uniform overseas in the 1940s, it looks like a bigger chunk out of the population than it does today. But we asked them to come here, something called the Barcelos program. And why? To grow the food to feed the people in America during World War II when there was rationing. And more than that, to grow food to feed our army fighting the European Pacific Theater. Who's doing that? Mexican nationals we have to come here. Then when the war's over, what do you know what they're going to do? They're going to take our jobs, drive down wages, and you know that other stuff too. So it's always there.
Thinking about what we've covered, it's ironic that the great fear of communism and our inability to distinguish between communism as an economic system and Soviet and Chinese imperialism has created the fear to the point where the biggest threat is not from the left, but from the right.
Right. Right. And that's been seen around the world. If you Augusto Pinochet's Chile, the 1970s, I think 1970s and 80s, it was that rampant fear. And look, let me be very clear, because you make a point. Communism was not some kind of, soft, fuzzy, innocuous kind of thing that people, were trying to embrace. It was doing some serious damage around the world to the tune of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. But at some point, you're right, we blurred the lines between, our hatred of communism and fighting it to where we enabled the powers on the right to become the very thing we're trying to fight against. Because, we need to remember this. Joseph Stalin was a totalitarian dictator who was a communist. Adolf Hitler was a totalitarian dictator who was a fascist. On the right, on the left, or on your right, my left, your left, either way, they were totalitarian dictators, meaning that they wanted all power for themselves under what ideology they chose to worship. That was the thing. In either case, Republican democracy ceased to exist. Sorry, didn't mean to scare y'all. Next question.
I really hate to be the one to ask this question, but history is proving the point. And what should we hope for?
What you can hope for is, there are different, take hope in this. The fact that American democracy went forward on January 6th. There was an attempted coup. We have, in addition to a culture of impunity, we have a culture of democracy in this country. Now, some of you that follow the news very well, you know that right now in Sudan, there's a civil war going on again. Why? Because in Sudan, they've been playing at democracy. They are more accustomed to having strongmen dictators. That's their culture. It can change. Not to say that's to suit these people, but that's politically, that's what they've had time and time again for decades and decades. We've had an entire national history where democracy, even when it was shaky and sometimes diminished, we told ourselves that's what we had. In 1864, instead of declaring martial law during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln allowed a democracy to allow for an election to go on. One that he wasn't really all that confident he should win. So there's instances like that. Instances like what happened in Tennessee the other day, when those two legislators were kicked out of the state house, but then they were voted back in, sent back to continue their duties. The fact that, so there are things like that going on, and the fact that the woman who was running for the Senate down in Arizona on the big lie, she lost. That poll workers around the country, these are all unfortunate events, but somehow the middle held. I'm just saying that the middle needs to be stronger and the guardrails need to be reinforced. The guardrails should not be like Michigan highways. They need to be much, much stronger. And I personally consider it a sign of hope that, when I ran for office, I only expected to get about 2 votes. I got 5 instead. That was encouraging. Yes. Does that answer your question, though? I mean, you have to look. They are not big sweeping things, But the fact that the federal courts over 60 times said the challenge to the election, no, no, no. Those are Republican appointed judges, Democratic appointed judges. The fact that we have three systems, checks and balances, the judiciary, legislative, and executive. The judiciary, independent judiciary, that concept by the founding fathers, a judiciary that independent of the people, not beholden to any politician or any group, could say, we are going to sit and judge this on the basis of the Constitution. It did its job. So the election was maintained and sound. But I'm saying we should not take that for granted. It's not time to go, well, let's go back and do something else right now. This is a 24/7 project, and democracy, the way we do it in America, is a hands-on, full sport participation. Well, I wasn't going to mention that. We have to be, look, this is going to sound so minimal. So, okay, well, what? But you know what? This is what I mean about the culture of democracy. These folks still cannot get in charge unless they're voted in place. Believe it or not, your one vote still matters. So what I tell people, and I think I said this in one of our earlier sessions, if people come to me complaining about, you see so-and-so got in a lot, did you vote? No, well then I don't have time for this. I got fewer birthdays than I used to. So I got to spend them on people, people that are serious about stuff. And again, it's important to remember, most of these dictators, a lot of dictators come to power through a coup. Many of them come because they're asked to take charge. That's through democratic process. They use democratic processes to destroy democracies. We can't let that happen. The first thing to do is to know about the democracy and its systems and its functions. That means knowing its history, its civics, its social studies, everything else. Not become just a nation of shopkeepers and clerks, but people are thinkers and critical thinkers at that. That means education. It means common investment. It means seeing that we're all in this together, not my neighborhood against you or yours against mine, that we're all involved in this together. I had a very, very necessary lesson from my senior thesis teacher in my undergrad. Dr. Hawkshaw one day said to me that she wanted me to take a history class, a Black history class from one of the white professors on the faculty of my college. And I went to an HBCU. I said, what can that guy teach me about Black history? I said, what do you know about being Black? About the Black experience? So she said, you're trying to tell me that you think a white man can't teach Black history? I said, what does he know about being Black? She said, but you think that because of that, he doesn't know Black history. I said, well, yeah. She said, what do you want to do later on? I said, teach history. She said, American history? I said, yes. She said, what do you know about being white? I said, nothing. She went, you know how stupid you sound? And it was a very, very necessary lesson that I heard from her. I'll tell you something else too. As a graduate student, my professor, Dr. Byrne, wanted me to write my master's thesis on a guy named Albert Gallatin Jenkins. Albert Gallatin Jenkins was a Confederate Civil War general. I said to him, Dr. Byrne, what in the 7 or 8 years of you knowing me, since I only spent the next 3 years, researching a guy that fought to maintain slavery? On the wrong side of the equation, as far as I'm concerned. He said, Mr. Johnson, I really think you should do that. You all that have been to grad school know that when you're advisor, I really think you should. That's an order. So I did it. And I went down there to West Virginia and got into the records and found this guy, everything he lived for, everything he believed, everything he stood for, I found repugnant, repulsive, and disgusting. But I also found out that he was married with children and that he was one of the first to sign up in the Confederate Army at the start of the Civil War, that he was the first to raid Ohio, or invade the North, not Robert E. Lee. That in 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg, he was blown off his horse when a cannon shell exploded above his head and was left unconscious for 3 days. When he woke up, they were retreating back south, back into Virginia. And that when Robert E. Lee put out a call for generals, Jenkins asked him to go home because he found that his wife was going blind. He asked General Lee to go home, and General Lee said, I can't afford to lose any more generals. So he stayed to fight for the cause. I began thinking, you know what? I think this guy is fighting for the wrong cause, for the wrong reasons, but his integrity and sticking to what he believes. I said, you know, I thought to myself at the time, how many politicians would I say are actually doing what they believe? You can trust them to follow through on what they say, to be loyal to somebody. By the time I got through doing that research, I saw him as being, I still thought he was on the wrong side. I still found everything about him, what he believed to be repugnant and disgusting. But I saw him as a three-dimensional human being, not as a caricature. That was necessary for me to be able to understand American history, both the people who I disagree with and the ones that I agree with. So I'm not just coming at it, with all, spleen and passion, but with informed civil discourse, which is what we need right now. So those two lessons were very helpful for me. And I think that would also tap into that thing about fear. If we get to understand each other as being something more than two-dimensional caricatures, but fully formed human beings who are fearful of, who are weak, fragile creatures, that will be an inoculation for when people rise up and try to sit up and take advantage of us. And we won't be into thinking like, well, it's just another one. When they get through what they want, they'll go away. No, they won't. We'll know that. Yes. Please.
I think there's another factor that's going on in this country is that the politicians are finding that they can make more money going into politics instead of working to make a more perfect union.
That's right. I heard something the other day about founding fathers were a bunch of very imperfect men who know that they were not, who wanted to establish the language and the mechanism to make a more perfect union, not a perfect union. But you're right, you absolutely cannot factor out the influence of money. And part of what was going on with that Fox News decision was the fact that they were making so much money off of broadcasting the inaccurate information. Telling the lie. And so look, let me wrap up with this. Whenever I get confused about it, whenever I find myself frustrated, like, how can people do, tell and believe such things, tell such big lies? I remind myself, my belief is this. I remind myself that a long time ago, it took an absolutely innocent man and drove nails into his hands and feet for saying some real simple messages. I want you to love your enemy, feed the hungry, clothe the homeless, take care of the widows and the orphans, stop cheating each other, love each other like brothers and sisters. People heard that and went, oh, we got to get rid of this guy. They killed him for doing that. If you can crucify, lynch someone for saying that, love your enemies, take care of, feed people who are hungry, put clothes on people who are naked, what empire does that threaten? So if they could do that, then what else can we not do? That helps me put it back in perspective. That's the nature of who I am. My bloodline helped kill that guy. So I cannot afford to take for advantage that we won't do something equal to or worse than that. That's how I keep myself balanced, or at least from sliding too much into despair. Do you understand? It's been great spending time with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Remember, May 2nd, the monthly meeting is going to be a great one.